In 2009, I sat across from a man who had just turned 63. He'd accumulated $1.2 million over 35 years of disciplined saving. In March of 2008, he had $1.4 million. By March 2009, when he walked into my office, he had $680,000. He didn't lose that money because the market crashed. He lost it because of what he did after the market crashed. He sold everything in October 2008, convinced it would go to zero. Then he watched from the sidelines as the market doubled over the next 3 years. The tragedy isn't that he panicked. The tragedy is that his panic was driven by psychological patterns that are predictable, preventable, and particularly dangerous after age 60. I'm going to show you exactly what happened to him, why it happens to so many older investors, and how you can avoid the same fate. Before I continue, I need to know something. What's your biggest fear about your money right now? Drop it in the comments. Be specific. Is it running out, losing half in a crash, not leaving enough for your kids? I read every comment, and your answer will help me create content that addresses your actual concerns, not theoretical ones. And if you're over 60 or heading there soon, subscribe now. This channel isn't about chasing returns or finding the next hot stock. It's about protecting what you've spent decades building. It's about second-level thinking, the kind that's preserved wealth through 9 recessions, 4 major market crashes, and countless moments of panic. The kind of thinking that separates investors who stay wealthy from those who lose it all when they can least afford to. Here's what I'm going to show you in the next several minutes. 7 psychological mistakes that older investors make with devastating frequency. Not market timing errors, not stock-picking failures. Psychological patterns that override logic, experience, and common sense. And I'm going to show you how to recognize these patterns in yourself before they cost you everything you've worked for. But you need to stay until the end, because the 7th mistake is the one that ties all the others together, and it's the one almost nobody talks about. Let me start with what makes investing after 60 fundamentally different from investing at 40 or 50. It's not just that you have less time to recover from losses. That's obvious, and every financial advisor will tell you that. The deeper issue is psychological. You've spent 30 or 40 years accumulating wealth. You've developed patterns of thinking about money that served you well during the accumulation phase. But those same patterns can destroy you during the preservation and distribution phase. The skills that build wealth are not the same skills that protect wealth, and the psychological framework that works when you're 45 doesn't work when you're 65. I've watched this play out for 5 decades. I've seen brilliant, successful people make catastrophic mistakes with their money after 60, not because they became stupid, not because they lost their edge, but because they didn't adjust their psychological framework to match their new reality. They kept thinking like accumulators when they needed to think like preservers. They kept taking risks appropriate for 40-year-olds when they were 70. They kept believing they had time when time had run out. The man I mentioned earlier, the one who lost $720,000 in 18 months, made all 7 of these mistakes, not sequentially, but simultaneously. They compounded on each other, creating a cascade of poor decisions that destroyed his financial security. If he had recognized even 2 or 3 of these patterns, he would have saved himself. But he didn't, and by the time he understood what had happened, it was too late to fix it. Let me show you these 7 mistakes. Not as abstract concepts, but as specific psychological patterns you can identify in your own thinking, because awareness is the first step toward protection, and protection after 60 is more important than growth. The first mistake is what I call recency bias amplification. You know what recency bias is? Everyone does. It's the tendency to overweight recent events when making decisions. You see it everywhere. The market goes up for 3 years, and people assume it will keep going up. It crashes, and people assume it will keep crashing. This is basic behavioral finance taught in every business school. But here's what most people don't understand. Recency bias gets dramatically worse as you age. Not because your brain deteriorates, but because your emotional relationship with money changes when you're no longer earning it. When you're 45 and working, a market crash is concerning but manageable. You're still adding money every month. You have 20 years until retirement. You can wait it out. But when you're 65 and retired, that same crash feels existential. You're not adding money. You're withdrawing it. You don't have 20 years. You might have 10 or 15, and you need that money to last. So when the market drops 30%, your brain doesn't process it as a temporary decline. It processes it as a threat to your survival. And that activates a much more primitive, much more powerful emotional response. This is what happened to the man I told you about. In October 2008, the S&P 500 had dropped 40% from its peak. He watched his $1.4 million become $900,000. Every day, it got worse. Every news channel showed panic. Every conversation with friends reinforced the fear. And because he was no longer working, because he was living off that money, his brain interpreted the decline not as a market cycle, but as a personal catastrophe. So he sold everything at almost exactly the bottom. The evidence for this pattern is overwhelming. A 2019 study analyzed investor behavior during the 2008 crisis and found that investors over 60 were 2.3 times more likely to sell during the crash than investors under 50, even when controlling for wealth, portfolio composition, and prior investment experience. It wasn't knowledge, it wasn't sophistication, it was psychology. The same market decline triggered a fundamentally different emotional response based purely on age and employment status. At Oaktree, we saw this from the other side. In 2008, we raised $11 billion for distressed debt opportunities. The people who gave us that capital, the institutions and individuals who committed money when everyone else was panicking, were not immune to fear. They felt it, but they had frameworks that prevented fear from driving decisions. They understood that recency bias amplifies with age and financial dependence, so they built systems to counteract it. They made decisions based on valuations, not emotions, on cycles, not headlines, on second-level thinking, not first-level panic. Now here's the second-level insight that most people miss. The problem isn't that you feel fear. Fear is rational when your survival depends on your portfolio. The problem is believing that your fear contains information about the future. It doesn't. Your fear tells you about your emotional state. It tells you nothing about whether stocks are cheap or expensive, whether the economy will recover, whether you should buy or sell. But your brain confuses the intensity of the emotion with the reliability of the signal. Strong emotions feel like important information. They're not. So, what do you actually do? You build a decision-making framework before the crisis hits. You decide right now, when you're calm, what percentage of your portfolio you're willing to see decline before you take action. Write it down. Make it specific. If my portfolio drops 30%, I will rebalance back to my target allocation. I will not sell, I will not panic, I will follow the plan. Then, when the crisis comes and your emotions are screaming at you to sell everything, you have something external to anchor to. You have a decision made by your rational self, not your terrified self. But recency bias amplification alone doesn't destroy portfolios. It works in combination with the second mistake. And this one is more subtle. I call it the illusion of experience. You've been investing for 30 or 40 years. You've lived through multiple market cycles. You remember 1987, maybe 2000, certainly 2008. You think this experience makes you better equipped to handle the next crisis, and in some ways it does. You have perspective. You know markets recover. You've seen it happen. But here's the trap. That experience also creates overconfidence in your ability to time the market. You remember that you sold some stocks before the 2000 crash. You remember that you bought during the 2008 recovery. Your brain edits out all the times you were wrong and highlights the times you were right. This creates a false sense of mastery. I see this constantly with successful people. They built a business, accumulated wealth, made smart decisions for decades. They assume this success transfers to market timing. It doesn't. The skills that build a business are not the skills that navigate market cycles. But the confidence from business success makes them believe they can predict market movements. So they trade more. They make bigger bets. They override their financial advisor's recommendations because they have a feeling about the market direction. The data on this is brutal. A 2017 study tracking investor returns over 20 years found that investors over 60 traded 40% more frequently than investors under 40, despite having no improvement in outcomes. In fact, the increased trading reduced returns by an average of 1.8% per year. They weren't getting better at timing. They were getting more confident in their ability to time, which made them trade more, which made them worse off. The illusion of experience cost them real money. I learned this lesson myself, though not with my own money. In 2011, during the European debt crisis, I was convinced Greek bonds would default completely. The analysis supported it. The headlines confirmed it. My experience told me I was right, but we didn't bet the firm on it. We sized the position appropriately. And when Greek bonds eventually settled at 40 cents on the dollar instead of zero, we didn't lose everything. The lesson wasn't that I was wrong about Greece. The lesson was that even when you're probably right, you might be wrong about the magnitude, the timing, or the second-order effects. Experience gives you pattern recognition. It doesn't give you certainty. So what's the second-level insight here? First-level thinking says, I've been investing for 40 years, so I know what I'm doing. Second-level thinking asks, what's the difference between pattern recognition and the illusion of control? And when you ask that question honestly, you realize that most of what you think is skill is actually luck, and most of what you think is predictive ability is actually hindsight bias. The action step is simple but uncomfortable. Track your predictions. Write down, right now, what you think the market will do in the next 12 months. Be specific, then check back in 12 months. Do this for 3 years. You'll discover that you're not nearly as good at predicting as you think you are. And that discovery will save you from making large bets based on false confidence. The third mistake builds on the first two, and this one is particularly dangerous because it feels like prudence. I call it defensive positioning at the wrong time. You've spent decades building wealth. Now you want to protect it. This is rational. This is smart. But here's what happens. You become so focused on avoiding losses that you avoid risk entirely. You move everything to cash or bonds. You refuse to hold stocks. You think you're being conservative, but you're actually creating a different kind of risk. The risk that your money won't last as long as you do. Let me show you how this plays out. In 2010, I met with a couple, both 68, with $800,000 in savings. They'd moved everything to cash in 2009 after the crash. They felt safe, they felt smart for avoiding further losses, but they needed $50,000 per year to live on, plus inflation adjustments. At zero interest rates, their cash generated nothing. They were drawing down principal from day one. I showed them the math. At that rate, they'd run out of money at age 83. They were likely to live past 90, so their safe strategy was actually guaranteed to fail. This is the paradox of defensive investing after 60. You feel like you're protecting yourself, but you're often creating the exact outcome you're trying to avoid. You're so afraid of market volatility that you accept the certainty of running out of money. You trade the possibility of a 30% decline for the guarantee of a 100% depletion. The evidence on this is clear. A 2018 study analyzed retirement outcomes over 30 years and found that retirees who held 0 to 20% stocks had a 47% probability of running out of money before death. Retirees who held 50 to 60% stocks had only a 12% probability. The safe portfolio was actually 4 times more likely to fail. Not because stocks always go up, but because inflation and longevity risk are real and cash doesn't solve them. At Oaktree, we think about risk differently than most people. We don't define risk as volatility. We define risk as permanent loss of capital. And from that perspective, holding too much cash in retirement is risky. You're guaranteeing that inflation will erode your purchasing power. You're guaranteeing that you'll have less money in real terms every year. That's a permanent loss. It's just slow and invisible instead of fast and obvious. The second level insight. First level thinking says, I'm old, so I should be conservative, so I should hold cash. Second level thinking asks, what's the actual risk I'm trying to manage? And when you ask that question, you realize the risk isn't market volatility. The risk is running out of money, and cash doesn't solve that. A balanced portfolio with enough stocks to generate real returns over time does. What do you actually do? You calculate your longevity adjusted withdrawal rate. If you're 65, you might live to 90 or 95. That's 25 to 30 years. Your portfolio needs to last that long and keep pace with inflation. That requires some exposure to growth assets, not 100% stocks, but not 0% either, probably 40 to 60% depending on your specific situation. You accept short-term volatility to avoid long-term depletion. That's not aggressive, that's rational. Now we get to the fourth mistake, and this one is psychological in a different way. I call it the legacy obsession. You want to leave money to your kids or grandkids. This is natural. This is admirable. But it becomes a mistake when you sacrifice your own financial security to maximize their inheritance. I see this all the time. People in their 70s living on less than they need because they want to preserve capital for their children. They skip medical care. They don't travel. They deny themselves basic comforts, all to leave a larger estate. Here's why this is a mistake. Your kids don't want your money at the expense of your well-being. They want you to be healthy, comfortable, and happy. And if they do want your money more than your well-being, they're not people you should be sacrificing for. But even beyond that, the legacy obsession creates terrible financial decisions. You refuse to spend down assets when you should. You hold inappropriate investments because you're optimizing for growth instead of income. You take risks you shouldn't take because you're trying to maximize the estate instead of funding your life. I watched this destroy a man's final years. He was 81 with $2.3 million, more than enough to live comfortably. But he lived in a small apartment, drove a 20-year-old car, and denied himself everything because he wanted to leave $2 million to his daughter. He died at 84 with $2.4 million in the bank. His daughter inherited the money and immediately felt guilty that her father had lived poorly to give it to her. She would have traded half that inheritance for 3 more years of seeing her father enjoy his life. But he never gave her that choice. His legacy obsession robbed both of them. The data shows this pattern is common. A 2020 survey found that 64% of retirees over 70 were spending less than their calculated safe withdrawal rate, primarily because they wanted to preserve assets for heirs. They were choosing poverty in old age to fund wealth for younger people who didn't need it and didn't want it at that cost. This isn't generosity. This is a psychological mistake dressed up as virtue. Second-level thinking asks, what's the actual purpose of my money? And the honest answer, if you think about it clearly, is to fund your life first and your legacy second. Your kids will inherit what's left. That's fine. But you don't optimize for their inheritance at the expense of your life. That's backwards. What do? You have a conversation with your kids right now. Ask them directly. Would you rather inherit more money or have me live comfortably and enjoy my final years? You'll be surprised by their answer. And once you hear it, you'll give yourself permission to spend your money on your life. That's not selfish. That's the entire point of accumulating wealth. The fifth mistake is related but distinct. I call it the advice paralysis. You're 65 or 70 and you know you need help managing your money, so you talk to financial advisors, you read articles, you watch videos like this one, you gather information, but you never actually implement anything. You're paralyzed by the fear of making the wrong choice. So you keep researching, keep comparing, keep postponing the decision, and while you're doing that, your money sits in cash earning nothing, or in an inappropriate portfolio that's either too aggressive or too conservative. This is particularly common with intelligent, successful people. They're used to making good decisions by gathering lots of information. That worked in their careers. But in investing, especially late in life, gathering more information often just increases anxiety without improving outcomes. You reach a point where additional research has diminishing returns, and the cost of delay exceeds the benefit of additional knowledge. I've seen people spend 2 years comparing financial advisors, during which time their cash lost 15% of its purchasing power to inflation. They were trying to optimize their choice of advisor, but the delay cost them more than any difference between advisors would have mattered. The perfect became the enemy of the good, and they paid a real price for it. The evidence shows that having any reasonable plan is better than having no plan while you search for the perfect plan. A 2016 study found that retirees who implemented a good enough investment strategy within 6 months of retirement had better outcomes than retirees who spent years optimizing before implementing. Not because the optimized strategy was worse, but because the years of delay had a cost that exceeded any benefit from optimization. Second-level thinking recognizes that in a world of uncertainty, speed of implementation often matters more than perfection of strategy. You can always adjust later, but you can't recover the years you spent paralyzed by indecision. What do you actually do? Set a deadline. Give yourself 90 days to choose an advisor or implement a strategy. Not 90 days to find the perfect solution. 90 days to find a good enough solution and start. You can refine as you go, but you need to start. The cost of delay is real and measurable. The sixth mistake is the one that surprises people because it seems like the opposite of a mistake. I call it the activity bias. You think you need to do something. The market is moving. Headlines are screaming. Your friends are making changes to their portfolios, so you feel like you should be doing something too. You log into your brokerage account, you move money around, you sell this, buy that, you feel productive, you feel engaged, but you're actually making things worse. This is counterintuitive because we're taught that action is better than inaction. In most areas of life, that's true. But in investing, especially after 60, the opposite is often true. The best action is frequently no action. The best decision is often to do nothing. But doing nothing feels irresponsible, it feels lazy. So you act, even when acting is harmful. I learned this lesson in 2005 and 2006. The market was going up, credit was loose, everyone was making money. At Oaktree, we sat on cash. We didn't deploy capital. We just waited. Our investors questioned us. The media criticized us. We looked foolish, but we weren't being lazy. We were being disciplined. We knew valuations were stretched. We knew the cycle was late. We knew the right action was no action. And when 2008 came, we had $11 billion ready to deploy at distressed prices. Our inaction in 2005 to 2007 enabled our action in 2008 to 2010. The data on this is striking. A 2019 study found that investors over 60 who checked their portfolios daily had 30% lower returns than investors who checked quarterly. Not because they had worse strategies, because frequent checking led to frequent trading, and frequent trading led to worse outcomes. The activity bias cost them real money. Second-level thinking recognizes that in investing, patience is action, discipline is action, waiting is action. You're not doing nothing, you're actively choosing not to do the wrong thing. That's harder than it sounds, but it's often the most important decision you make. What do? You limit your portfolio checks to once per quarter. You give yourself permission to ignore daily market movements. You recognize that volatility is the price you pay for returns, not a problem you need to solve. And you remember that after 60, your job isn't to maximize returns. It's to not do anything stupid. And most stupid things come from unnecessary activity. Now we get to the seventh mistake, the one that ties all the others together. This is the mistake that amplifies every other mistake. I call it the isolation trap. You're making financial decisions alone. You're not talking to your spouse honestly about fears. You're not working with an advisor. You're not discussing your strategy with anyone who can provide perspective. You're isolated in your own thoughts, your own fears, your own biases. And that isolation makes every psychological mistake worse. This is what destroyed the man I told you about at the beginning. He made his decision to sell in October 2008 alone. He didn't tell his wife until after he'd done it. He didn't call his advisor. He didn't talk to anyone with perspective. He sat alone watching CNBC, feeling his fear intensify, and he acted on that fear without any external input. If he had talked to anyone, if he had shared his thinking, someone would have said, wait, let's think about this. Let's look at valuations. Let's remember what happened in every previous crash. But he didn't give anyone that chance, and his isolation cost him everything. The evidence on this is overwhelming. A 2021 study found that couples who made financial decisions jointly had 40% better retirement outcomes than individuals who made decisions alone, even when controlling for wealth and education. It wasn't that couples were smarter. It was that the act of discussing decisions with another person forced them to articulate their reasoning, which exposed flawed thinking before it became action. At Oaktree, we make every significant decision as a team, not because any individual lacks competence, but because the discussion process improves outcomes. Someone says, I think we should buy this. Someone else says, why? And in answering that question, flaws in reasoning become visible. Biases get challenged. Assumptions get tested. The decision that emerges is better than any individual would have made alone. Second-level thinking recognizes that your brain is designed to fool you. It's designed to make you feel confident when you should be uncertain. It's designed to amplify fears and minimize risks. You can't fix this by thinking harder. You fix it by talking to other people who can see what you can't see in your own thinking. What do you actually do? You find someone to talk to about money, a spouse, an advisor, a trusted friend. And you make a commitment. Before any significant financial decision, you'll discuss it with that person, not to get permission, but to test your reasoning, to expose your biases, to hear your logic spoken out loud, because hearing it often reveals flaws that thinking it doesn't reveal. So here's where we are. 7 psychological mistakes that older investors make. Recency bias amplification, the illusion of experience, defensive positioning at the wrong time, the legacy obsession, advice paralysis, the activity bias, the isolation trap. The man I told you about at the beginning made all 7, and they compounded on each other, creating a cascade of poor decisions that destroyed his financial security. You now know what he didn't know. You have the framework he didn't have. The question is, will you use it? Because here's the reality. Knowing these mistakes intellectually is easy. Recognizing them in yourself when you're feeling fear or greed or urgency is hard. Most people will read this, nod along, and then make the same mistakes anyway. Because in the moment, emotions override knowledge. Fear feels more real than principles. Don't be most people. Before you go to bed tonight, write down which of these 7 mistakes you're most vulnerable to. Be honest. Then, write down one specific action you'll take to guard against it. That's your first step. That's how you turn knowledge into protection. And subscribe if you haven't already, because this channel is about second-level thinking. It's about understanding the psychological patterns that destroy wealth so you can build systems that protect it. It's about learning from 5 decades of market cycles so you don't have to repeat the mistakes that others have made. Over 60 with money you can't afford to lose? These 7 psychological patterns are more dangerous than any market crash. But they're also predictable, and what's predictable is preventable. You just have to be willing to see them in yourself before they cost you everything.